You're listening to the Engage Jeffco Podcast, where we explore the people, priorities, and stories shaping life here in Jefferson County. I'm Amber.
And I'm Johnny. Whether you've lived here for years, just moved in, or want to feel more ready for whatever comes your way, this podcast is here to help you stay connected and informed.
In this episode, we're talking about how Jefferson County is preparing for wildfires, floods, and other natural hazards, and how you can be ready too.
That's right. We sat down with Steph Baker and Brian Keating from the Emergency Services section of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, along with Pat O'Connell, an engineering geologist with Jefferson County Planning and Zoning, who specializes in floodplain management. Together, they offer an inside look at how the county plans for emergencies before they strike.
They walk us through everything from evacuation alerts and wildfire mitigation to the real-world simulations happening with a high-tech tool called the Sim Table. Plus, we talk flood insurance, go bags, and what it really means to be your own hero in a disaster.
This is a conversation filled with practical advice and a behind-the-scenes look at how local agencies and community members like you can work together to stay safe.
Let's get into it. Here's our interview with Steph Baker, Brian Keating, and Pat O'Connell. So I want to welcome in Pat, Steph, Brian. Thank you guys for being here to teach us more and, just discuss more about emergency services and what you guys are doing during active disasters and even in between and to prepare. So we're really happy to have you guys sitting down with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
So before we get too deep into our topics, can you just first tell us some high-level resources that people need to know, either during or before to prepare for the event of a disaster or emergency event?
I think one of the most important things consumers and citizens can do is sign up for Lookout Alert. That's going to be your nexus of awareness that something is going on. Our dispatch center, Jeffcom, maintains all that information, but we partner with them to push that. So if I had to pick one takeaway, sign up for Lookout Alert. And with that, it's part of the Smart 911. You can put multiple things in there, such as maybe I have mobility concerns. I might need help in the event of evacuation. I'm going to need longer assistance times with that. I have animals, whatnot. You can streamline those alert types that you get as well with maybe I only want to focus on weather in regard to the safety components.
Some may not know that the Sheriff's Office has an office dedicated to emergency management. Can you give us an overview of the Emergency Services Department?
So within emergency services, we have 4 tiers. We have the Office of Emergency Management, Wildfire, our Critical Incident Response, and our Incident Management Team and Hazardous Materials, the HAZMAT program. Each has their own responsibility, but we do work in conjunction with each other. So for me, I can speak best to emergency management. That's part of the preparation, prevention, protection, response, mitigating, recovery components of any type of incident, large or small scale. But again, we do work with our partners within emergency services. Brian, would you like to talk more about the wildfire?
Yes, sure. So the wildfire program, the county's in a transition phase right now. We're standing up a rather significant wildfire program. And as Steph mentioned, a lot of the work that we do to prepare for wildfires and mitigate fire risk across the county, a lot of those measures actually cross over all hazards in the county. So some of that preparedness, that awareness, like Lookout Alert, like Steph mentioned, generally for citizens, that applies to whether it's flooding, a wildfire incident or whatnot. A lot of our preparedness plans, if we have a wildfire on the landscape post-fire, there could be flood impacts. So a lot of our planning crosses between different program areas, even within emergency services, as well as with other county programs.
And like you said, you guys are doing things even when there are not active disasters or hazards. Can you guys kind of talk about how you all keep yourselves, other departments and partners trained and prepped and ready for active disasters such as wildfires and even flooding as well?
So for us, regarding emergency management, our bread and butter is staffing the Emergency Operations Center, or the EOC. We can't do that on our own. We call in a lot of community partners, both internal to Jefferson County and external. So having those folks ready, whether it's a fire, a flood, a snowstorm, that preparedness and readiness is key. So for our EOC team, we have approximately 100 people that we can call upon at any given time. And with that, we offer quarterly trainings, which can be anything from a seminar, drills, but we do try to engage them in some type of mock scenario where we work through, if this were to happen, what are your roles and responsibilities? How do you handle this? What kind of cascading effects can we plan for and prepare for in a real world incident to work through those? So that's part of it. We also meet quarterly with our external folks, which we call them the Jefferson Emergency Managers. It's our GEMS group. Again, we foster and leverage a lot of relationships, which is paramount for responding to and recovering from disasters.
Related to floodplain management, and one of the things you'll hear throughout this podcast is how much collaboration there is through inter-county departments and divisions. So planning and zoning, we have regulations that require development to go through the floodplain management program in our floodplain overlay district. So when new development occurs, the structures are sized properly. We also have a very robust inspection program to ensure that these control measures are functioning as designed and being maintained as required. So the main thing is that the county works very closely with other divisions, departments, everything from Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport to transportation engineering, road and bridge, certainly emergency services.
And following up on that, we do host a variety of trainings as well. Aside from our quarterly meetings, we do try to incorporate a lot of our regional partners just to help grow and foster those relationships that we know we will need.
I know we wish that there were never any emergency events or, horrible disasters, but they happen and we have these hazards and you all keep your teams and your departments and partners prepared. But how can community members stay prepared for any type of emergency?
So as I previously mentioned, the lookout alert is huge. Just having that initial situational awareness can increase the public awareness and response and protection capabilities immensely. The other thing I would suggest is talk with your neighbors, go through your neighborhood, create a plan. What would happen if an incident X were to affect you? Make a go kit, an emergency go bag, and then ultimately stay in tune with the weather and what's going on. We know that a lot of our disasters are weather related. So just knowing that what's coming and what's going on is paramount.
So something else that I would add is a lot of our partners do a lot of planning beyond just the county, right? And so for the wildland fire, part of incident preparedness is every fire district within the county, and we have 14 different fire districts, they have created community wildfire protection plans. And those plans outline a lot of information on what citizens can do to be prepared, what they can do to mitigate their risk. And the go bag that Steph mentioned, that applies to all hazards. So we talk about go bags a lot in the wildland fire nomenclature, but those go bags are good for any kind of hazard. And then there's other community groups out there that are actively engaged. A lot of our fire districts have community ambassador programs. So again, Steph talked about get to know your neighbors and what they're doing. If you're part of an area, a fire district that has a community ambassador program, make sure you're aware of who that is and you're engaged, because that's just a wealth of knowledge and resources that are shared neighbor to neighbor and help ensure that that community is going to be as prepared as possible for if and when some kind of disaster does hit.
Very similar to what Steph and Brian said, the first step is really evaluate your risk, right? And risk is going to be variable across the board. And then one of the things that happens with these disasters is that financial burden to the residents, and ways to try to minimize that financial burden. Talk to your insurance company, look at what is covered or not covered. And certainly we've seen in past wildfires that there can be a gap in coverage versus what it costs to rebuild. We can chat about flood insurance. Generally, most homeowners insurance does not cover flooding. So that would be a separate policy, and it's worthwhile at least getting a quote on that. And again, that can help the individual property owner evaluate their risk.
The community depends on you all during these disasters, but we do have that philosophy, be your own hero. Brian, can you kind of talk about what that means as your department's actively fighting a wildfire?
Yeah, so a few years ago, the county stood up a program, and I think it's managed through the sheriff's office, and citizens can access that through our emergency services website. But there's a Be Your Own Hero campaign. So there's a lot of resources there. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek approach a little bit. There's some fun little videos to watch, and some of our partners participated in that. But it really highlights the perspective that the best way to ensure your safety during an incident is to take responsibility individually. So having that awareness, being prepared, the Be Your Own Hero campaign, again, talks about go bags, talks about creating defensible spaces, knowing what your evacuation routes. So it touches on a number of different components that an individual resident or homeowner can do to make sure that they're as prepared as possible so that are not having to think about these things during an emergency when everybody's minds are going elsewhere and whatnot. So that's really what the Be Your Own Hero campaign is about. We encourage people to visit that website and take advantage of the resources there and be educated and take actions proactively so that they're not having to deal with it when an emergency actually hits.
To follow up on that, historically, we try to push that living in the metro area, we know that we do have a lot of resources, more so than many other communities. But with that preparedness and champion yourself, rule of thumb is 72 hours. We want you to be able to maintain and take care of yourself. Those guidelines may be changing with the way of the current federal administration and programs and things that are available now, but we really do push that. Be able to be self-sufficient for 3 days before quote unquote help gets there.
And with us, pushing into summer, I think the biggest thing on everyone's mind is wildfire season. And can you guys kind of discuss when wildfire season is in Colorado, with it now being looked at as a year-long season?
Yeah, so the idea of a wildfire season in particular is kind of old school. We talk about the wildfire year, and certainly Colorado's no stranger to that. You had the Marshall Fire that occurred December 31st, one of the most destructive in terms of loss of homes and structures in the state history. But we do, for the core part of our wildfire season, if you want to call it that, we really have two areas with that heightened risk. We have the early springtime, typically before we get some of those spring rains and green up, where all the grasses and vegetation start to flush out, like right now. We've had a really great wet month, and so our grasses continue to stay green. But once the rain stops, those grasses are going to cure out. And so we'll have a period here in midsummer when the hills will all be brown and the fuel moistures in our vegetation will decrease. And so we have heightened fire risk then. But then hopefully we have a good monsoon season, late July into August, and then we get a second flush or a second wave of green up. And so our fire risk diminishes. But then again, that faucet kind of turns off. And then as we get into mid to late fall through the winter months, we'll have that heightened fire risk again. So, and even despite those green up periods and whatnot, really citizens just need to be aware that we live in an environment where there's always fire risk. And so anything that they can do to be prepared and take actions to try and mitigate that risk year round is really critical.
And then with the slash program that the county offers, how important is that to combating wildfires in Jeffco?
So the SLASH program is a great resource for our citizens. It's managed, jointly between the Open Space Program and the Jefferson Conservation District. It provides an outlet. So again, we're encouraging personal responsibility, homeowners to create defensible space. And so a lot of times they will take the action. They will cut down trees or vegetation, undergrowth on their property, but they don't know how to dispose of that biomass. And so the SLASH program operates multiple sites across the county through the summer months, in which residents can take their slash down and dispose of it. The importance of that is obviously it's a resource for our residents to help them mitigate their fire risk, but year after year, the demand for the slash program keeps setting new records. We keep raising the bar. And so it's a critical part of a comprehensive approach to mitigating risk throughout the county, and just a great resource and tool, and something that I know Open Space and the Conservation District is constantly evaluating to see how they can expand it, how they can make it more accessible. They're constantly reevaluating the program. So year after year, there may be more opportunities. Last year, they stood up a new site at Tinka Bridge, and that will become their hub of most of their operations, I believe, moving forward, and may have expanded hours as the program continues to grow.
What's a community wildfire protection plan, and how does that also help with those fire risk and mitigating that?
Yeah, so Community Wildfire Protection Plan, or CWPP, we call it. For Jefferson County, there's two levels. We have a county CWPP, so we evaluated fire risk at a county level scale. and we identified values that were especially at risk. Obviously, the wildland urban interface where we have homes mixed in with vegetation, that's a high value. We don't want to lose structures. Travel corridors for, let's say, if there was an evacuation scenario, we want to make sure those egress routes are protected and available to citizens. Other things like communication towers, transportation infrastructure. But for Jefferson County, one of the big things is, and Pat probably want to touch on this, is watershed value. So the watersheds that are part of Jefferson County actually supply water, drinking water, to over 2.1 million residents along the Front Range. So if we were to have a fire that negatively impacted those watersheds, it's going to impact a lot more citizens than just those that live in Jefferson County. So watershed values was a big component of how we evaluated risk in our CWPP. And then the CWPP also identifies mitigation actions for the county to take. Again, our county CWPP was kind of that 30,000 foot viewpoint looking at the entire county, but then every fire protection district actually has their own CWPP, and many of those have been recently updated or are in process of being updated. And that's where I really encourage folks in terms of that preparedness idea is to become familiar with the CWPP of your fire protection district, because those zoom in on the landscape and they're much more prescriptive in terms of what kind of actions should be taken, what kind of preparedness residents should be aware of, and things like that. So 2 different levels of CWPPs. They're both very important, and the county CWPP is what is helping us inform investments that the Board of County Commissioners is making in the wildland fire program and helping to lay the blueprint for what we're going to be focusing on moving forward.
And that's really interesting because some people may think your main focus is infrastructure and lives, which it is, but there's a huge focus like the watershed and seeing just how many people that impacts, over 2 million people. Can you kind of touch on that, Pat?
Certainly. And that goes to hazards in general, right? Hazards in general do not respect jurisdictional lines, right? So that really prompts entities to work together, to work collaboratively. Just like Brian said, we work with a number of different watershed groups that include many of the cities, the towns, the water districts, and adjacent counties. And the idea is to identify those private and public assets. Just like Brian said, it includes one of the assets is water resources for a drinking water supply for not just residents in Jefferson County, but for residents throughout the metro area. So the idea is to identify those assets and do the proper planning. What can we do to address and try to protect those assets post-wildfire?
Colorado's winter weather and heavy spring rains, they already pose a threat of flooding. And a scorched land from wildfires can only exacerbate those things, like you touched on, Brian. How can Jeffco community prepare for flooding, especially given it's so unpredictable?
We do the preparation in multiple phases. Much of it is from a regulatory standpoint where new development has to meet certain standards. And we have a very high threshold and a very robust floodplain management program. We also members of the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP Community Rating System, which rates communities and their floodplain management program. We're tied for the highest ranked county in Colorado. So we have a very solid program. So much of that goes, we see that when we have events and we don't see lots of damage to private or public assets. So our preparation is in the regulatory phase and in the inspection phase. And that's everything from inspecting existing culverts, which convey those flows, and working with emergency services, working with watershed groups, and doing different types of mitigation techniques. And if there's debris is also one of those hazards that's going to clog conveyances and push those flood flows to other directions.
Pat, can you also discuss kind of how wildfire, flood risk, they go hand in hand? They're so connected in so many ways.
They really are. And that's, again, it's, I think, one of the advantages of Jefferson County. We work very closely internally, and we work very closely with external agencies. From a flood after fire risk, you're going to have increased runoff, and you're going to have that increased hazard for 5 years until we start seeing vegetation. And if we look at the Hayman, then we're closer to 20 plus years of still seeing that risk. So the risk is increased flows because the fire is going to destroy that vegetation, which would have absorbed that precipitation. If it's intense enough, it's actually going to change that soil makeup and going to cause increased runoff. So we are going to see higher flows post fire for up to 5 years. And then not only higher flows, but debris. And so that area is significantly increased as well.
I'm going to toss it back to you, Brian. So much of Jeffco is considered to be a part of WUI. How does that make combating fire in our community even more of a challenge, having all of that wildland and vegetation in our county?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. So our old CWPP had classified about 76% of the county as wildland urban interface or WUI. The update that we completed last year and that was adopted by the Board of Commissioner now classifies 91% of the county as WUI. And that represents the increased fire threats that we're seeing in our landscapes, not only here in Jefferson County or the state of Colorado, but across the entire Intermountain West, right? We have more fires entering more urban corridors, just like what the Marshall Fire was. There's different kinds of risks and different kinds of threats in these WUI areas. In the mountain areas, it's more about the trees mixed in with the homes and things like that. When you get into the urban corridors, it's more about embers coming off the hills and spreading into homes and then fires spreading home to home. And so how do you prepare for that and what's the challenge of that? It really speaks again to that preparedness, making sure that residents are aware. So for residents that live in, let's say, Arvada in a very urban setting, they might think, oh, I don't have a wildfire risk. But there are things that they can do. They can harden their home so that if we have that big ember wash that comes down, that home will be more resistant to igniting itself and then igniting the neighbor's house and things like that. So having that awareness, having that classification is the first step in creating that awareness, and then really educating folks about different measures and mitigation actions they can take regardless of where they live if they're part of that WUI. And then working with our partners, our fire district response partners, on how do you combat those kinds of fires, those urban conflagrations and whatnot, to make sure that we're prepared for that if and when they occur.
Can you talk about the sim table? It seems like a pretty fun and effective tool for simulating fires.
Yeah, so we acquired the sim table through a grant last year, and it's been a great training tool, not only for us at the county, but it's mobile. So we've had fire districts come and take the equipment, bring it back to their firehouse and conduct trainings and things like that. And it starts off, historically, we worked in a sandbox. We would have this big sandbox and we would mold the landscape with the sand to represent an area. And then we would use like little matchbox cars and things like that, or little toy airplanes and simulate a fire. But technology being what it is, the sim table takes that and applies a digital footprint to it. And with all the data that exists out there, not only data in general like Google Maps or Google Earth or USGS topo layers and things like that, we can overlay that into the sandbox area to mold our landscape and make it more realistic. But all the data that's coming out of like our CWPPs, all the risk data, all the evacuation modeling that we do, we can load that into the machine as well. And then we can simulate a fire on a landscape and we can run scenarios. We can paint cars on the landscape and hit play and it'll show the fire growing and it'll show all the cars evacuating out of the landscape using like a streets like, Google Maps, following the streets, and we can set up evacuation centers. And that helps us identify ahead of time of where we think there's going to be traffic congestion points. So we can do that ahead of time. We can incorporate that real time during an incident. The state of Colorado has these multi-mission aircraft. So when we have an incident, they fly at very high elevations and they take lots of video feed. We can download that real time, project that onto the sim table. And so where Steph works, like the Emergency Operations Center, where we've got county leadership and other managers that are part of decision-making processes, they can see what's going on modeled on this sim table, see where the resources are being applied and where we're having success and where we have challenges. And that can help inform some of the critical decisions that the Emergency Operations Center is helping to facilitate and support as well.
It's really amazing that you guys have that technology and it has so many different uses that you guys can use during or even before in preparation.
And I would also emphasize it's not just for wildfire. So we can do modeling for air pollution like plumes. So let's say we had a hazmat, some kind of a chemical spill, and there's a plume that is going to threaten the community. We can model that. We can bring in all the floodplain data and we can model 100-year flood. So there's all kinds of different scenarios. It's not specific just to wildfire.
A lot of people are discussing things happening on the federal level, and it's expected that there may be more of a financial burden placed on local governments in the event of emergency. And what are some ways that you all in your department are working to combat that possible loss of funding?
So we have to be creative,
Yeah.
and we are working with our leadership teams to best utilize the assets that we currently have. And this also ties in with our whole community approach, too. We really need to leverage our neighbors, those partnerships that we have created in preparing our region and bringing those assets to the table. So, yeah, a lot of creativity, thinking outside the box in this. And it is kind of day to day to see what's going to happen in the future, but we are planning for a reduction in funds. But not only with that, one of the good things we have coming out of this is we are expanding our wildfire, the mitigation program. So that has been something good for the county and our residents here. But again, we got to do the best with what we have.
Right. And you guys do. With community members who say, oh, I don't live near a body of water, and they may think they're not in danger. Are they? And how can they assess those dangers and be mindful of those when it comes to flooding and floodplain issues?
So that goes to know your risk. Obviously, if you're in a designated flood zone, your risk is going to be higher. It's already been modeled. It's been identified that the risk is there. Even if you're outside the designated flood zone, you still have a risk. Generally, a third of damages during large flood events occur outside of the designated flood zone. So even if you're just outside the flood zone, you still have a risk. A positive in that stat is that you are eligible for reduced flood insurance if you're outside of the flood zone. Anyone can purchase flood insurance, even if you are on the top of Lookout Mountain. Your risk may be low, but you would still be eligible to purchase flood insurance. Again, it's that know your risk, and there's many different resources with Jefferson County, whether it's with emergency services or Jefferson County planning and zoning staff. Planning and zoning staff is able to create different maps, show different risk hazards, different storm events, and then also even able to meet people on site if they're interested in discussing drainage issues.
And Pat, how often do we as Jefferson County and also just statewide experience large flood events?
Generally statewide in the range of 20 to 30 flood events on an annual basis. Out of those 20 to 30, generally 5 are considered major flood events. What we've seen more recently are smaller, more intense storm events. So a smaller land area, but more damage.
And how can community members reduce their risk being caught off guard by a flood?
To reduce your risk, and again, depending on where they are, where that property is, that risk is going to be variable. It's unlikely the risk is ever nil, but what we want to do for the residents of the county is to make sure that they know their risk and try to minimize that risk. And so the county works very closely internally, externally to better define that risk. We have a very large education outreach program. We work very closely with Mile High Flood District, which is the drainage district for the metro area. And we work with them on education and outreach. So we try many different sources, many different partners. And then each property, that risk is different, very similar to wildfire.
And you guys have all said throughout our conversation, know your risk, know your hazards, no matter the disaster, no matter the time of year. Where can people find more information about different hazards and how to combat those and prepare beforehand?
So a great tool that the public can reference is the Jefferson County Hazard Mitigation Plan. We are currently in the process of updating that, but that version is on public-facing websites. Go to www.jeffco.us. It's available there. That outlines community risks. It does have some mitigation strategies in there, but just getting that information of knowing what's in your neighborhood will be paramount.
I think in addition, on the sheriff's webpage, if you go, there's a tab dedicated to fire restrictions and other information. You can click on that and find out if we're currently in a fire restriction or not. And through those websites as well, the wildland fire component of that webpage, there's also links to a lot of different resources like the Be Your Home Hero campaign we talked about, how to sign up for Lookout Alert. It's a bit of a one-stop shop to get a lot of those kinds of resources. And then a lot of the plans, like our CWPP, there's a whole section dedicated to resources and links citizens can get as well.
And I would add, similar to what Steph said, jeffco.us, that's going to be the starting point for many of the internal documents, emergency services, as well as planning and zoning. We have an online mapping tool that includes floodplains. And that mapping tool is called a JMap. And if you just search for that, that'll pop up. And other resources include the Mile High Flood District, and that is mhfd.org. And then the National Flood Insurance Program has a website, floodsmart.gov, that has many resources as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys. And before we go, do you guys have any final thoughts?
I have one thing, folks listening, if you want to sign up for Lookout Alert, you can text that word Lookout Alert to 67283.
And I would add, anyone who is interested in the either risk from hazards, wildfire, or flood, and you have questions or comments, please let us know. We always appreciate getting feedback on this.
And I would just echo kind of the theme of a lot of this conversation is for folks to be aware and be prepared. Don't wait for an incident to happen to start thinking about what you can do and to be prepared and how you would react. Be aware, mitigate where you can, practice even like evacuation routes, practice driving those, making sure you know what they are, and have your own plan for your household and make sure everybody's informed what that is.
Thanks again, Steph, Pat, Brian, for sitting down with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks again to Steph, Brian, and Pat for sharing their time and insight, and for the vital work they do year-round to help keep Jeffco prepared and resilient.
From wildfire mitigation to floodplain planning, it's clear that emergency preparedness isn't just about responding to disasters, it's about building relationships, using innovative tools, and empowering people to take action before an emergency hits.
If you're ready to start preparing, be sure to sign up for Lookout Alert, explore the Be Your Own Hero campaign, and check out Jeffco's Hazard Mitigation Plan. You can find all of those on our website at www.jeffco.us.
And as always, if you have questions or ideas for future podcast topics, send them our way. We love hearing from you.
Engage Jeffco is also a monthly newsletter. You can find a link to subscribe in our show notes, along with all of our social media handles.
And if you love this podcast, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. And don't forget to share this episode, especially with your neighbors. Community preparedness starts with conversations like this.
Thanks for listening.
Stay safe, Jeffco.